Can you believe these people destroying their history like this? It's outrageous. I mean, look at that statue of Hussein. I mean, sure, he was a tyrant and a mass murderer that seized power illegally, but come on, people. That's part of Iraq's history. You know, when people don't respect their history, they have no regard for their own heritage or national culture. Here it is again. People in the Ukraine removed over 1,000 statues of Vladimir Lenin. You think that's enough? I mean, that's part of their history and heritage. Okay, so maybe the Soviet regime brutalized a few people, but let's get serious. That's in the past. Why do we want to keep dwelling on these negative things that happened in the past? What matters now is that Lenin was part of the nation's history, and if we don't have these statues, we'll surely forget he ever existed. Changing a street name? How will people know which way to go if you change the name of Adolf Hitler Street like that? I mean, sure, he was one of the greatest villains of history and a mass murderer the likes of which the world has never seen, but wasn't his leadership part of Germany's history? What right did a bunch of American SJWs have to undermine German culture like that? Without that street name, there's no possible way for people to learn about his part in German history. This kind of historical ignorance is absolutely shocking, and just another example of left-wingers pushing their agenda into every aspect of life. Really, street names are more of a local issue anyway. Oh god, these SJWs are totally out of control. That statue of King George in New York was part of our national story and our history, and they just pull it down? Their iconoclasm has no end. These people will stop at nothing with their PC commitment to rights and justice and not being ruled by a king. Where does it end? Whose statues are next? Oh, now it's too far. I know Benedict Arnold was a traitor and stuff, but he doesn't even have a statue at the Battle of Saratoga Museum. He won the battle, for Christ's sake! If it wasn't for him, the US might have not even gained French recognition in the key alliance that helped with the American Revolution. He's one of the most brilliant commanders of the entire American Revolutionary War, and all he gets is a boot with no name on it. Where do the indignities end? It's not like he's a traitor or something. Okay, so he was a traitor and he sold out his new country later on and actually led a military expedition against the United States, even burning down towns in Connecticut. But these lefty Philistines will stop at nothing. This guy's an American hero and a brilliant military commander. I think at this point you probably get where I'm going with this. Erecting statues is an old tradition. Some of the earliest art that we possess as a species are these little statues of fertility goddesses, maybe. Here's one. They're often called Venuses because of their association with fertility. Building statues is an old human tradition, but so is tearing them down. Rulers throughout history have constructed statues largely for political purposes. While many of these statues later on are recognized for their artistic or cultural significance, that's not really why they got built in the first place. See, ancient rulers understood that statues were a way to easily communicate some political idea to a large, illiterate audience. So they're walking down the street and they see the big statue and here we are. It's a way of the ruler doing a few different things. One, he can kind of glorify his own personal achievements. Or if a later ruler builds a statue to a former ruler, it's often for dynastic reasons or to highlight some kind of policy connection and to identify the current power structure, the current leadership. Maybe it's a single king, maybe it's some group with some previous glorious era that allows them to kind of bask in the glory of these past leaders. So ancient rulers built statues not really for artistic or cultural purposes per se, for the most part, but largely to propagandize themselves to their public. If you pay attention to historical or political commentary online, a big thing that those guys like to talk about, they're mostly guys, like to talk about our Greco-Roman civilization. So the Romans, right, held up as a cornerstone of so-called Western civilization, Latin language, engineering, republican government, the Senate, all that good stuff. they often built statues too, for either religious or political reasons, or honestly both. The Romans didn't really differentiate between those two things. But despite that fact, the Romans would also tear down statues with great gusto in many cases. Sometimes they'd repurpose them, but a lot of times they just straight up tore them down. So how can this be? Did the Romans not love their history? Did they not care about their heritage? Was that a problem for them? By act of the Roman Senate, a former leader's memory could be damned. Statues toppled or repurposed. Stone inscriptions literally chiseled out by a guy. This actually happened to the Emperor Commodus. Here's an example. This was a practice called Damnatio Memoriae, the damning of a memory. And the Romans did it a lot. They did it for Commodus, like I said, but they did it for a bunch of other leaders too. Usually emperors, usually after they had been somehow discredited or overthrown, usually assassinated. Sometimes they committed suicide. Sometimes they committed suicide to avoid assassination. Like, you get the idea. So oftentimes, both the erecting of statues for the Romans was a political project, but so was the removal of them. So statues from the jump and throughout their entire lifespan for the Romans were political. They weren't necessarily informative. They were a propaganda vessel. And the Romans used to do this a lot. They tore down the statues of Caligula. Oh, sorry, wrong picture. I don't know how that got in there. Oops, here's the right one. Nero. Let's hear what he has to say.
Doesn't mean we won't, and we are totally prepared. It doesn't mean we won't. But think of it. You hear 35 and 40,000 people, and we've lost nobody.
Why does this keep happening? All right, here's the right picture in here. Here's the right picture in here. I got it in there now. And the aforementioned Commodus. You remember him. He's the bad guy in Gladiator. So why'd the Romans do this? Erase memories and tear down statues. For the Romans, history was propaganda, and propaganda was history. Ancient Roman leaders and emperors, they built things and erected statues and constructed monuments for their personal glory, or an ancestors, which to most Roman leaders was the same thing. Augustus, the first emperor, was notorious for this. He built statues all the time, and in Augustus's statues, he always looks exactly the same. He is ageless and striking a regal pose. Roman historians always had a very, very, very transparent political agenda. It doesn't take long to realize it once you start reading one. And often their political agenda was reactionary. Most Roman historians were intensely conservative and always were complaining about the modern values of their particular society at a particular time. Hell, the Colosseum is only called the Colosseum because it was built next to a colossal statue of Nero that he had erected while he was in power. Honestly, it was almost as big as the Statue of Liberty. Its actual name is the Flavian Amphitheater because it was built by the Flavian dynasty. And the Emperor Vespasian, the first ruler of the Flavian dynasty, when he started construction of this amphitheater, well, they didn't want to tear down the Nero statue because it looked cool. So they just repurposed it, put a little crown on there, and dedicated it to the Roman god of the sun. I wonder if Vespasian at the time was accused of being a triggered SJW, forgetting about Rome's great historical legacy and past by erasing the memory of Nero, one of Rome's worst emperors. The Romans understood that building a statue in bronze or marble was fundamentally a political act, and tearing one down or effacing some inscription was also a political act. They understood this throughout their history, and they did it a lot. Sometimes it was totally unjustified and was an effort to just kind of settle a political score. Sometimes it wasn't, and a memories leader probably deserved to be damned. Looking at you, Caligula. We have to remember that the vast majority of Confederate war statues weren't built right after the Civil War. They were often built decades later for a very obvious political purpose. That political purpose was to engender the lost cause myth, where the South fought gloriously for their freedom. These statues were also built to enshrine the segregationist regimes that got put in power after the end of Reconstruction. They propped up the public conception of the South as righteous defenders of freedom and white supremacy is a good thing. They're like the flying buttresses of Jim Crow, holding up a regime that was put in power after federal troops were withdrawn and perpetuating a revisionist view of the South's participation in the Civil War. Southern leaders in the decades after the Civil War recognized that statues in public spaces embody political priorities. And in Southern statuary, they look like the winners. Their generals sit astride horses or stand in triumph, despite the fact that they were defeated on the battlefield and their regime discredited. But you wouldn't know that to look at the statues. And that's the point. That was the point to the white public in the South, and it was a point very clear to the African American public in the South, that those in power in the South were the descendants, maybe biologically, but certainly ideologically, of the Confederate generals defeated, but now monumentalized in stone. See, these leaders understood that statues are a way of communicating to a public in a very easy and transparent way. And that communication is that the North might have won the war, but not really. And the Southern leaders who perpetuated segregation were still in power. And the proof of that power was the construction of these statues decades and decades after the generals memorialized had died, whether they even wanted the memorials or not. And that's the situation here. Southern leaders built these statues for largely political purposes around the turn of the 20th century. There's a lot of other articles and videos that have explained this in far more detail. See links below. But the point here is that statues in the South, just like in ancient Rome, were constructed for political purposes. The problem with uncontextualized historical propaganda is that it's incredibly dangerous and misleading. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it. In my class, we look at propaganda all the time. It offers a really valuable glimpse into what past political leaders and societies were thinking. If I show a clip to my class of Triumph of the Will, rest assured I do it with a truckload of context. You have to. That doesn't mean you shouldn't watch it, but you need to understand what it's all about and where it's coming from. But that context is really hard to provide when you're driving by on a city street to see a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Everybody who sees that statue understands what that society is all about. That's why it was built, to communicate a political or ideological message to a broader public quickly. So you can't just wish away that political message when you look at a statue like that. If I show a clip from Sergei Eisenstein's film October about the storming of the Winter Palace, I need to explain to my class that the storming of the Winter Palace when the Bolsheviks took over in October 1917 didn't really look like that. Eisenstein is one of the most influential and impactful filmmakers ever. But that doesn't change the fact that he was a propagandist, and that needs to be understood before you watch his films. Leni Riefenstahl was an extremely talented filmmaker, just like Robert E. Lee was an extremely talented military commander. But the fact is, Leni Riefenstahl was a propagandist for the Nazi regime, just like Robert E. Lee used his military talents to perpetuate a system of government that sought to maintain the existence of race-based chattel slavery. Riefenstahl's depiction of Nazi Germany can't be taken at face value. That would be ridiculous. Despite her many achievements as a filmmaker, she shouldn't be monumentalized in stone in German cities, just like Lee, despite his many achievements on the battlefield, should not be similarly monumentalized because of the fact that his military command was dedicated to a political purpose that was reprehensible, just like Riefenstahl's filmmaking talents were dedicated to a political purpose that was vile. So sadly, we turn our attention to Gone with the Wind. I love Gone with the Wind. It's a great movie. I've seen it dozens of times. It's like a triumph of cinema. but it also has a propaganda feel to it. And you need to understand this. I'm not saying don't watch Gone with the Wind, but watch it critically and understand it has a propaganda function. You don't need to look too far for this. It just comes right out and tells you. Look at the prologue, for God's sakes. That doesn't mean I don't like Scarlet or I'm not invested in her story. That doesn't mean I dislike Rhett. I like Rhett just fine. He's the only character who's cynical enough to seem to realize he's in a propaganda movie. But I can't take Gone with the Wind's depiction of the antebellum South at face value. Just like I can't take the depiction of Russia in Battleship Potemkin in October at face value. Propaganda needs context. That's what documentaries and bumpers that present information or museums or classrooms are for. And frankly, a little plaque next to an equestrian statue ain't gonna cut it. There's no question that statue removal can be taken too far. And there's probably two related historical examples that I've seen brought up in the context of Confederate statue removal. One is unquestionably the Cultural Revolution in Communist China during the 1960s. So Mao Zedong created an organization called the Red Guard, which is mostly young people, and would whip them up into a fury based on his charismatic leadership, and they destroyed a number of monuments throughout China, but also launched an enormous number of attacks on his political opponents and on Chinese institutions like hospitals, courts, and the educational system. So this went on for several years and was incredibly disruptive to Chinese society. But what Mao was trying to do was get rid of old culture, old habits, old ideas, and old traditions. And he was doing this as a way to kind of institutionalize revolution and ensure his own personal power. So I don't know if the Red Guard and the Cultural Revolution is really akin to this. The Cultural Revolution was from the top down. Now, definitely his followers took initiative and independent action, but it was often at his behest. This movement against the Confederate statues seems to be from the bottom up, and I think is actually most akin to almost kind of a silly example during the French Revolution. So in the kind of the height of the French Revolution, mob violence turned on Notre Dame, which eventually was renamed temporarily the Temple of Reason. And there's a bunch of statues of biblical kings that adorned it. Well, the Paris mob took down those statues and guillotined them. And this is kind of an example of perhaps statue removal taking an obviously almost ridiculous turn. However, it is important to remember that for centuries the French people had been subjected to authoritarian oppression by a feudalistic, absolutist state. So perhaps the destruction of these statues, while silly, is merely just kind of a over-exuberant expression of pent-up discontent from the lower class. I think that might be more similar to some of the excesses of statue removal we've seen over the last few weeks during the protest movement. Statues are inherently political. They're not really meant to be learned from in any inherently educational sense. They're not informative. They're politics through art. This and this weren't built for educational reasons so that the citizens of a country could learn about the ruler's reign objectively. It's really ridiculous to argue otherwise. Politics and statues are intimately connected, and statues are built for propaganda reasons. Kings don't erect a statue so their subjects can academically learn from it. They're built for political propagandist reasons. Removing statues is also political. When the Ukraine effaces the memory of Lenin and removes over 1,000 statues built to him in their country, it was done to break with a Soviet past that represented genocide and oppression. The Confederacy, to many Americans, including me, represents treason and white supremacy. Lee, Jackson, Davis, however talented these men might have been, They put their talents in service to a regime that sought to perpetuate chattel slavery and impose white supremacy by force and terror. We still know who Caligula and Nero are, even though their statues were moved or repurposed and their memory was damned by the Romans. When the Romans did this, they did it to communicate to their citizens that these rulers were misguided, cruel, and brutal. The Romans understood the role of statues in public life. Why don't we?
Well, thank you for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos, and at the end of all of them, they say, please like and subscribe. So I guess please like and subscribe if you want more historically defensible claims about modern day issues and their historical parallels. Like I said, thanks for sticking it out to the end, and I'll catch you next time.